All right, Pastor Marc Driscoll here. We're going to talk today about the nation of Israel. Let me just come right out and say it. I think that the media narrative, especially through the mainstream media on Israel, is completely off kilter and inaccurate. I believe that the filter given to younger generations, like my own kids, who don't agree with the narrative, but it is one that really comes from social justice, deconstructionism, and postmodern thinking, and it ignores reality and the Bible. And so, what I wanted to do today was to do a bit of a backdrop on the nation of Israel, the history of the nation, the people that are there today, and of course, it's in the headlines. We're looking at what seems to be impending war in Israel. Turkey and Iran have both said that they are looking at invading. We know that Iran, through their funded proxies of Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, are conspiring to attack and invade Israel. And so it's really a dire time. We also know here in the United States of America that we do not have a fully cogent and competent leader in the White House, which means our investment and our involvement in what could be a major powder keg of international conflict we're in a very vulnerable position. So all that to say, we're going to get into a lot, but I've got a friend here today, a new friend, and maybe introduce yourself and a little bit about your background and why this matters so much to you.
Well, first of all, Mark, thanks for having me on. My name's Marc Turnage. I have an over 30-year history in the area of the Middle East. I lived in Israel and studied there, did my master's and doctorate in Israel for 7 years, have been leading trips for Christians, private church groups, academic universities and colleges to the lands of the Bible. So Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Turkey, Greece, Italy for over 25 years. And while my area of specialization and focus in my studies and in a lot of my writing is ancient Judaism and the origins of Christianity, as a person who has lived in the region, deals in the region, and so forth, in more recent years, I've been asked a lot to speak on the issue of kind of where are things and how did they get there? And, everybody wants to say that the situation between the Israelis and the Palestinians is very complex. And I'm not necessarily certain it's as complex as we want to make it, but I definitely think that there's a number of threads that come together that create what many people, especially in the West, see as great complexity.
So you're a Christian. You've been in country
Yep.
for years. You visited numerous times. How do you see what's going on presently in Israel, particularly in relation to Gaza, as compared to what kind of the mainstream media narrative is? And would you agree with that or disagree with that? What would your perspective be from more of an inside-out view?
Well, I was actually there on October 7th.
Oh, wow.
And had family actually in the very eye of the storm, so to say, that were literally in the attack. So I think that I think that there are several problems here. I think number one, within the Western media, we tend to frame things through a very post-Enlightenment worldview that is also, as you already alluded to, very postmodern. And we assume that everybody thinks and looks at the world the same way we do. And we're not very good at realizing that other cultures don't always look at things the same way that we do. And so I think when, obviously you have the history that of, let's say, the modern, what eventually becomes the state of Israel, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and so forth, which whenever people want to start this conversation, my question to them is always, when do you want to start telling the story? Because when you start telling the story is really going to determine how you tell the story. And most modern historians of the modern Middle East usually start around 1799 with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. And then, of course, this leads to some of the reforms that take place in Egypt under the reign of Muhammad Ali. And so this period of the early the tail end of the 18th century, early 19th century is really where I would say we need to start looking and thinking about, telling this narrative. It doesn't start in 1947 or 1948. It doesn't start in 1967. It's before that. And so I think that that's one of the challenges that does not often get presented within the media. I think the other issue that we're dealing with here is one of a religious nature. And even within Christianity, while we use the Old Testament as we should, we don't always think in the way that the Old Testament thinks about itself. And one of the things that's central to God's covenant with Israel throughout the Bible, both Old and New Testament, I would say, is number one, that the God of Israel is Israel's God, no others, right? The first commandment. But the other side of this is that the codification of God's relationship with Israel as his chosen people is tied up in the Torah, the scriptures, right? But there's a third aspect to this as well, and that is the covenant of the land. Yeah. So within Judaism, for thousands of years, there is the idea of land is sewn into their religious ideology. So whenever we think about and even look at Jewish history over the past 2,000 years, that as you had Jews being expelled from the land due to a series of revolts in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the Jewish community for years has repeated every year at Passover, next year in Jerusalem. So the land is part of that ideology, right? And so that's one aspect of this. And you have Jewish immigrations in the Middle Ages, where Jews immigrated. In fact, some Jews immigrated from Spain during the Spanish Inquisition and came to the land of Israel. In the 17th and 18th centuries, you have Jewish immigrations that were religiously motivated immigrations, even messianic, you would say, that come into the land of Israel. So this idea that gets presented today in Western media that at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, that all of a sudden the Jewish community decided, we want to go back to this land and so to say invaded and colonized the land and so forth, just doesn't fit when we look at Judaism and Jewish history. At the same time, part of the problem here is because, again, we look at Islam through this kind of post-Enlightenment, postmodern worldview too. And central to Islamic theology is the division of the world into two camps. On the one hand, you have what is called Dar al-Islam, which means any piece of planet Earth that has ever come under the authority and rule of Islam. That land is considered sacred into perpetuity. At the same time, you have the rest of the world, which is not Islamic yet, which is called Dar al-Harb, which means the world of the sword. And it is the job of a faithful Muslim to change Dar al-Harb into Dar al-Islam. So land, and this is again where, especially for Christians, because we don't have really an ideology of land or a holy land or sacred land within, especially our Protestant theology. To us, that seems very strange because you can be an American Christian, a German Christian, a Russian Christian, and, that just goes along with it, right? But it's not that way either in Judaism or Islam. And so when we start trying to talk about even the modern politics, we can never disassociate them from religiously what has gone on and what is going on. And then I would say there's a third level to this as well, that in the 19th century, both within the Jewish communities outside of what becomes the state of Israel, and also within Islam, you had certain movements that led to what we see today, both in terms of when we think about what's going on in Gaza and what happened on October the 7th, but also what has gone on with the establishment of the state of Israel and things like that. And so within the Jewish community, you had the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, Protestant Europe and Catholic Europe that was very anti-Semitic in the 19th century. Never forget that ultimately gives birth to the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. And so that anti-Semitism breeded modern Zionism. So when people today want to say, well, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist, that doesn't work historically at all. They're one and the same, because modern Zionism was birthed out of European anti-Semitism and in response to that. The other thing that happens, though, is at the end of the 19th century, leading into the early 20th century, both with World War I and then ultimately World War II is kind of the nail in the coffin of this, is you have the collapse of these empires, right? So the British Empire, the Hungaro-Prussian. And so these empires are breaking up, and you have the formation of nation states in result to that. And one of the things that one of the early pioneers of the modern Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl, came in and said, we Jews, scattered all throughout the place, we are one people. And that's in response to what we see as this burgeoning nation stateness that is developing at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. But in Islam, especially Sunni Islam, there was a reform movement that took place in the 19th century as well called Salafism. And basically Salafism, the fundamental principle was, hey, we as Muslims, we used to be at kind of the top of the food chain, right? In the Middle Ages, we were above the Christians. We were more developed. We were more advanced. Our society was more advanced. How did we all of a sudden become under the heel of others? Because, of course, part of what empowered Islamic faith was this idea that we burst out of the Arabian Peninsula and very quickly conquered so much of the known world. So they look at this and say, that was God's blessing on us. That was the blessing of Allah on us, right? But Salafism says we're no longer in that power position. Why? And there were two streams that kind of emerged out of that. One said, well, we're not in the power position because we have not modernized. And so this is where you get, even within, like, for example, the Emirates today and so forth, these pushes towards modernization. And you saw this really in the 1950s and 60s in a lot of the Arab world with the development of this pan-Arabism, right? But there's another side to this. The other stream of Salafism says, no, we're not in the power position any longer because we have forsaken being good Muslims. And therefore, we must return to the ideals of Islam, Dar al-Islam. And that is what is going to return us to the power position. That branch of Salafism is what Hamas is tied to.
Okay.
And so I know I just threw a ton of stuff out there, but those are kind of the channels and the rivers that are flowing and that all kind of come together to create what we're seeing in this modern reality, not just within Israel and the Palestinian territories, but also within the greater Middle East as well.
So thank you. Honestly, that was a masterclass in history. And so thank you for summarizing what you've obviously spent decades learning. So for those who are in America, especially those who are younger and getting brainwashed with social media algorithms, so the Marxist paradigm in our culture is there's the powerful and the powerless, and that those who have power have obtained it unjustly, and they wield it unjustly to oppress and take advantage of those who have less or no power. And so then the goal of social justice is always to align with the victim. And so the victim is always the one who bears no responsibility for their own condition. And so as we sort of take that sort of Western academic framework and try and overlay it over a problem that goes all the way back to Abraham with two wives, more than 4,000 years ago, that Marxist paradigm, it just doesn't fit. It doesn't work. And quite frankly, what happens, I believe, as well, is I believe education in the West and the Marxist paradigm, it's so deeply entrenched, but it is reinforced through American slavery, which is wrong, sinful, and taking human beings and making them property is completely antithetical to the Word of God, and the fact that we're made in the image and likeness of God, and we didn't evolve. We have dignity and human rights. But to take that and then to take that sort of slave narrative and to put it as an overlay for what's happening between Gaza and Israel right now, it literally does not fit. It's not the same narrative. It's not the same principles. It's not the same justice. And so right now, if you had to summarize in the Middle East for those who are Muslim Arabs, especially those who are in Gaza or, in surrounding areas, including Iran, versus those who are, Jewish, Israeli, what do the two sides want? What are they committed to? And it sounds to me like it's a divine commitment. The Muslims think, this is what we are working toward, fighting toward, in allegiance to our God. Similarly, the Jews are saying, no, this is our commitment and this is our devotion and this is our goal to be faithful to our God. And so when someone comes along and you guys need to compromise, you need to find a place in the middle. When you're dealing with deeply held religious commitment, that's called compromise, and that just doesn't happen. So what do the Muslims want, and what do the Jews want ultimately? Not just today, but ultimately, if they were to obtain the outcome they desire.
Wow. So I think that there are several layers to answer the question that you're asking. I think that the summary of this actually can be summarized in the words of Ernst Bevin. Ernst Bevin was a member of the British Parliament. And you'll remember that after the end of World War I, prior to World War I, from the 16th century to 1918, the land of Israel, what we call the Middle East today, so Jordan, Israel, West Bank, Gaza Strip, Syria, Lebanon, it was all part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. And 1918 comes, end of World War I, 1920, you get the League of Nations, and the League of Nations gives the British a mandate to establish a Jewish state in the lands west of the Jordan River, what today is the state of Israel and the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And everything seemed to be going great. This was kind of the idea. You get what's also called the Balfour Declaration in this period. But British sentiment begins to swing against the Jews during this period of the mandate. So that in 1938, the British release what are called the White Papers that essentially restrict Jewish immigration into British mandated Palestine, as it was called at that time. And Ernst Bevin, who was very anti-Jewish, but he was a member of the British Parliament, in February of 1947, before the United Nations set up the partition plan of British mandated Palestine as the British were handing over their mandate, Ernst Bevin says this in Parliament about the situation in the land. And I think that to a great degree, this is still the summary of the reality there. And here's what he says. He says, His Majesty's government have thus been faced with an irreconcilable conflict of principles. For the Jews, the essential point of principle is the creation of a sovereign Jewish state. For the Arabs, the essential point of principle is to resist to the last the establishment of Jewish sovereignty in any part of Palestine. And that really, again, Ernst Bevin was not in favor of a Jewish state, but he recognized already in 1947 that you have two fundamentally different set of principles that are governing the populations in the area. And I think that this is still part of it. Now, clearly, the state of Israel today is not solely a Jewish state. 20% of Israeli citizens are Arabs, both Christian and Muslim. You have other minorities like the Druze, who are an Arab people, but they belong to their own religion. You have others like Baha'i and so forth. So the state of Israel, while a Jewish state, is a democratic state, and it has democratic minorities within this state. And the Arabs in Israel have full rights in the state of Israel. They vote in elections. They have representation in the Israeli parliament. They serve as Supreme Court justices. They're doctors. They're lawyers. They get the same education. They get the same, social benefits and all of this sort of thing. When we move into the areas of the Arabs living in the West Bank, living in the Gaza Strip, now these are what we typically will refer to as Palestinians. And obviously that's not the same. They're not the same as the Arabs in Israel. And I would say in general, what Ernst Bevin said in February 1947 still kind of holds true in terms of kind of what the end game is here. Now, when you add in Hamas, which is an Islamic movement, not just Arab, but Islamic movement, their idea is to set up an Islamic state from the river to the sea, which literally means the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. And that chant is not a statement of political freedom or liberty. That chant is a statement of, we are going to return the lands that are sacred to Islam back under Islamic control.
So within the founding charter, but the founding charter of Hamas, it clearly states that the principal goal is to eradicate the nation of Israel and the Jews, to not only remove them from the land, but to remove them from breath, and to take the land, to occupy the land, and to have it ruled as an Islamic state. I mean, correct. Is that correct? And so Hamas is the government in perpetuity. For those who don't understand, Hamas is the government in perpetuity in Gaza. This is their government. And we tend to think, well, Hamas must be, some outlier terrorist group. And can't we deal with them and then just instead, establish or work with an established government? No, that is their government. And the mastermind of the October 7th attack was just put in charge of the government. So the butcher of butchers is now the head of the government. And this is why they are able to use civilians as human shields for international sympathy and also for covering. And the result is that at the end of the day, you're not dealing with a group that is hated by their own people. They're actually supported by their own people, and their own people, in large part, agree with their agenda of overtaking Israel and eradicating the Jews. So at that point, who do you negotiate with to even come up with some let's meet in the middle sort of compromise? You're dealing with an impossible situation insofar as I could tell it as an outsider, having been on the ground. I mean, would you agree or disagree that that's just kind of where we are today?
I would frame it a little bit differently. I think that everything that you've said about Hamas is correct. But where I would say I do think that I think that there's a couple of things both going on locally and a little bit more regionally here that are driving this. Listen, Hamas took power. That yes, there was an election back in 2007 when Hamas took power of the Gaza Strip. Now, here's how Hamas handled their power, because of course the other main party within the Palestinian kind of polity is the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, it's called locally. And what Hamas did when they gained power in an election, and there are reasons why they won the election, and it's not that necessarily everybody was in favor of Hamas, it's just that Hamas, for years, the Palestinian people saw the world, the UN, the US, and others give hundreds of millions of dollars to the Palestinian Authority, and that money never trickled down to the street. And Hamas was coming in and building hospitals and schools and doing things for the people, and that's how part of the way that they won. Well, what they did is the leadership of the Palestinian Authority in Gaza, after Hamas won the election, Hamas took them to the top of the tallest building in Gaza City to see if they could fly. And when they couldn't, Hamas kind of basically gained a stranglehold on, and so there is a truth that Hamas terrorizes the people in Gaza. Okay. The other side of this, and this is the more regional side of this conflict. Now, that's not to say that all the Gazans are then become pro-Israel, right? Just because they would be anti-Hamas, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're pro-Israel either. But then we can never forget that although Hamas and the people that live in Gaza are Sunni Muslims, you've already alluded to this, they're being backed by Shiite Iran.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think is going to happen, first of all, I think that, Hamas needs to be gone, not just for the people of Gaza, because the leadership of Hamas have become billionaires on the backs of their people. And the reality prior to October 7th is Israel was giving work permits to over 10,000 people in Gaza to come work in Israel, where they could earn a better wage, where actually because of the nature of Israeli kind of health and social services, they received Israeli kind of social security and health insurance and things like this, but yet in Gaza, the daily wage was about $2 a day.
Wow.
And, Hamas took all these billions that have been given, and they, instead of building, because Gaza has the best beaches on the Mediterranean. And instead of building what really could be a gorgeous area and resort and infrastructure and things, they built tunnels. They built up there. But the thing is for me, I think that in order to break also what Iran is doing within the region, I think that once Hamas is removed, you're going to have to work with the local people to govern. And how that looks, I don't have that solution, but I do think that Israel, the United States, other countries are going to need to bring in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, not just to help fund the rebuilding of Gaza, but also to break Iran as a player in Gaza. And the reality is right now, what's kind of ironic since October 7th, many of the people in Gaza are not in favor of Hamas. Again, that doesn't make them all of a sudden pro-Israeli.
Sure.
But in the West Bank, where they haven't had to live in the consequences really of the war like the people in Gaza have, Hamas's popularity has risen because it was kind of like they stood up to Israel and did this thing to Israel. So I would just say that there are nuances that I think that are there, as opposed to just, well, all the Gazans are Hamasites. Hamas terrorizes their own people, and that's one of the reasons why they need to be gone, even to just save the Palestinians in Gaza from Hamas.
And I appreciate that. So it sounds like the greatest hope would be appealing to those average citizens who are not pro-Hamas, but just want to get their life back. Within that, what percentage of Christians, I mean, you and I, we love Jesus. Mm-hmm. What percentage of Christians are in Gaza versus Israel? And if you know, maybe even Iran. I mean, there's a bit of a underground next generation Christian revival that is underway in Iran, and Iran is the bad actor in the Middle East. And so if there was any hope of God's people, increasing in number and influencing there, that would be great. But what does the Christian population in church look like, Israel, Gaza, and Iran, if you know it?
I don't know in terms of Iran. The population in Gaza of Christians is very small. The Christian population within the Arab world in general has been decreasing in recent years. Just to give you some statistics, in Bethlehem, which of course is in the West Bank, it's not in the Gaza Strip, but prior to the Oslo Accords, which that's the era of 91, 92, 93, the Christian population in Bethlehem was over 60%. Mm-hmm. The Oslo Accords turned not only the policing of Bethlehem, but also the civic governance of Bethlehem over to the Palestinian Authority. And from the early 90s until today, we've gone from over 60% Christian to now it's down under 10% Christian. And that pretty much, that's kind of everything has followed suit throughout really the Arab world of the region. What's interesting, and this is one of the things that I that I often point out to people, and this isn't me being an advocate for, I think that Israel needs to be held accountable for things and has a right to be held accountable for things also. But the only country within the modern Middle East where the indigenous Christian population are either maintaining their numbers or growing is the democratic state of Israel. And so in cities like Nazareth, which Nazareth is in the state of Israel, it's predominantly Arab. Many are Muslims, the majority are Muslim, but you do have Christians, you have Catholic, you have Orthodox, you have Nazarene, you have Baptist, and so forth. And you do see the local Arab population that is Christian in the state of Israel maintaining its numbers and growing, which you don't see in Syria or Jordan or Lebanon or the West Bank and Gaza Strip or Egypt. And so that's just one of the statistical realities as it relates to the Christians. And that's why when people want to say, well, Israel is an apartheid state, it's not. It's not an apartheid state, especially if you're going to use the definition of apartheid as we saw with, like, say, South Africa. It simply is not.
So one more question and then whatever you'd want to add. So for those of us who are Bible-believing Christians, and especially those who are younger and maybe they're not up to speed on all of the issues, or maybe they've been force-fed a progressive narrative which is not dealing with reality, from just a Christian who believes the Bible perspective, why does Israel matter so much? Why should we pay attention? Why should this be important, even as we head into an election season that even America's relationship with Israel factoring into our vote? Why is that important from a Bible standpoint?
Well, of course, I think one of the challenges that modern Christians face is, and it often gets wrapped up today in our discourse around Israel, is the revival and resurgence of a lot of replacement theology, that the church has replaced Israel. And I would say, from my reading of the New Testament, the Gospels, Paul, Revelation, that in nowhere does the New Testament ever teach that the church has taken over. In fact, I think that Paul's image of the olive tree and speaking to his non-Jewish Christ followers in Rome and saying that you have been grafted in, and remember, it's the roots that support you and not you the roots. I think that is in fact, I would even go so far as part of why Paul uses that image is because there was a certain triumphalism that was developing among his non-Jewish Christ followers to say that we've kind of taken over. We're now the chosen. And Paul's like, no. Your participation in what God is doing redemptively with Jesus and with the redemption that Jesus began, that ultimately will culminate in the revelation of God's reign throughout the universe, that is, you're being brought into what God has promised redemptively to Israel. Mm-hmm. And I would also say that even within the Gospel of Luke in particular, repeatedly, you have Jesus and his movement tied to the redemptive hopes of Israel. And I think one of the problems where we often miss this is because we're not familiar often with ancient Judaism, the Judaism of Jesus and Paul. But ancient Judaism believed at the end of the age, not only would Israel be redeemed, and that's not just a political redemption, it's spiritual as well, but that at the end of the age, those non-Jews who had been idol worshipers would turn from their idols, worshiping the God of Israel, and that the hope of the nations was in their turning away from worshiping their idols to worshiping the God of Israel, remaining non-Jews. I mean, we can still eat our bacon, right? We can still enjoy our ham. But the point is, we have to forsake the idolatry and all of the immorality that was around the idolatry within, so to say, the polytheistic pagan world. But yet we're participant in the promise that God made to Israel of redeeming Israel. And Luke's gospel in particular, both in the words of Jesus and also in what Luke writes about things around Jesus, makes that really very clear, that Jesus and his movement are part of what God is doing. And I would say this continues on in the book of Acts. I mean, remember Acts 1:6, Jesus' disciples come to him and say, is it now that you're going to restore the kingdom? And Jesus doesn't say, guys, what? I literally was crucified and you're still stupid? I mean, he doesn't say to them, oh, no, you've misunderstood. He says, no, it's not for you to know the times or the seasons. In other words, your question is the right question. Now it's just not the right time. Mm-hmm. And then he says, but you're going to receive power and the Holy Spirit will come upon you and you're going to be my witnesses, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the ends of the earth, right? And so that's really what our job is to be. But remember, Acts 1:8 comes from the question of Acts 1:6. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think that we can sidestep that. Now, of course, people want to say, well, the modern state of Israel is not biblical Israel. And there's some truth and reality to that. The modern state of Israel is a secular state and so forth. And those are issues that we can talk about and even ask questions. What is our responsibility as Christ followers in light of what the New Testament teaches about the relationship of non-Jewish Christ followers to Israel and the Jewish people? Those are great questions that we could be having right now within the church. But I would say the idea that you get that somehow the church has replaced Israel within what God is doing, I think it's problematic, and I don't find it myself within the reading of the New Testament.
So just to summarize, as your new nerd friend here, what he's talking about, the replacement theory, is commonly known as dispensational theology, and that is that there are two peoples of God, and that God worked through Israel, and now he's working through primarily the Gentiles that are the church, that one day he will rapture the church, and then he will have sort of an end times revival, depending upon your view on all of this, with the Jews in the nation of Israel. And so there's two people of God, and God is generally working primarily, if not almost exclusively, through one group at a time, versus more what would be called New Covenant theology, and that is that there's one people of God saved by grace through faith, either in the first or second coming of Jesus Christ. And so there would be what we would call in New Covenant theology continuity between the covenants and the people of God. In the other would be discontinuity. There would be different covenants, and there would be two peoples of God. And so a lot of American evangelicalism, if a lot of American political activism is driven by sort of a Marxist narrative, a lot of Christian evangelicalism in America and in the West is driven by the discontinuity, dispensational theology, and the two peoples of God. And so for a lot of people that just grew up in the church or were going to church or, learning the Bible, you may not have known that, but there was a massive theological decision upstream that was overlaying even how the Bible was taught to you, whether it's continuity or discontinuity. And so anything else you would want to add before I let you go, my friend?
The one thing I think that's also important, though, especially when we keep talking about, and you've said this a lot, and you're absolutely spot on this, on the issue of kind of this political Marxism. I think that something that is also absolutely important to understand with this is because why does this political Marxism sound so good, especially within younger generations, the millennials, the Gen Zers, and so forth? And I think that this is something where within the West itself, we need to understand that ultimately what happened in the Enlightenment was the fusing together of a Judeo-Christian morality with kind of ancient democracy, democratic and republican ideas as we've seen it exercised in Athens and in Rome. And what happens, though, is coming out of the Enlightenment, because part of the Enlightenment is pushing back against religion and organized religion and things like this, is you come through the 19th century and pretty much all of the European moral philosophers were of the opinion that the Bible is a myth, that the God of the Bible doesn't exist, right? I mean, we hear things like theism and so on and so forth. And I think that one of the things that happens with because of course Marxism arises in the 19th century is essentially what Karl Marx is trying to do is take what we find in the verses of the Magnificat in Luke's gospel, that he wants to bring down the mighty from their thrones and elevate the poor and the lowly. Marx is trying to do that, but devoid of the God of the Bible.
Yeah.
And I think that because this even plays into this, how you address this narrative with Israel and Gaza and so forth. And I think that one of the things, and I've been asking people this for really the last 4 years as I've kind of been speaking and talking to different groups, I actually have found myself going back to the criticisms of this kind of 19th century moralistic philosophy that Nietzsche has. Right? And Nietzsche comes in and says, listen, you can't kill the God of the Bible and maintain the value structure of the Bible. And of course, he comes at it from a different way. And then we get the ultimate perversion of this in kind of the Nazism of the 1930s and 40s. But I think that we need to remember that in human history, whenever we have tried to physically bring the mighty from their thrones and elevate the weak, it's always resulted in huge human bloodshed. I mean, the Nazis were monsters for sure, but they killed far fewer people than Stalin and Mao. And I think that one of the problems is that the ideas often baked within Marxism literally sound biblical.
Yeah.
And what happens then is, so if that's the way I'm going to look at things through this kind of post-Enlightenment reality, and I'm going to come, then all of a sudden I'm going to look at the narrative of the modern area of Israel and Palestine and say colonizer, decolonizer, powerless. And
oppressor, victim. Yeah.
Exactly. And we've even overlaid this kind of racial component. And what's kind of hysterical in all of this is, yes, you absolutely have Jews that came out of Europe and Eastern Europe that were, white. But you have to understand that at least 50%, maybe even 60% of the Israeli population today came out of North Africa, out of Spain, out of the Arab world. Mm-hmm. Right. And so, I mean, when we try and do, as you said earlier and alluded to earlier, kind of refracting this through slavery within the United States, and which was racial, right? That's not what's going on here. And I think that part of what I would hope that young people who, especially are Christians, would not only learn a more complete history, but I would also challenge them to understand what the underlying assumptions are of the narratives that they are imbibing, and what the byproduct and the outgrowth of those narratives become. Because that really, when you look at what's gone on, last year in terms of the protests on college campuses and university campuses and everything like that, it's all being driven by this. And I would even challenge you and say, absolutely, the Bible talks about peace and social justice. But the Bible always puts at the center of its discussions of peace and justice the God of Israel. So you cannot ignore the God of the Bible and then maintain the value structure of the Bible.
Mm-hmm. Well, then there's a vacuum that either gets filled. Well, it gets filled by the demonic, and then it gets filled by the government, and the government's always aspiring to replace God as the source of highest authority. And so that's precisely what we're seeing is government gets bigger, the demonic forces get more powerful, and people think that it leads to human life and flourishing, and it never does. The more that God is absent, the more the demonic is present, the more that freedom is erased and government is enlarged. It, throughout history, has never proven human liberation, flourishing, and freedom. It produces the opposite over and over and over. But if you're 20 years old, you've not been around long enough to know that. And so thank you for your time. Where can people find more from you or find more about you? You've done let me just say this too, not in a patronizing way. You've taken incredibly complicated, deep issues and synthesize them as a translator in a very efficient and proficient way. And so I know that that's a lot of work and that's a lot of skill. So thank you for doing that. And where could people find more about you and your study and your work and what you're doing?
I own two companies. My first company is called Biblical Expeditions, and so you can search for us on the web. My other company is an online learning platform, and it's called Windows into the Bible University. And then I also have a Substack that I write, which is Biblical Nomad, so people could find me there.
Very cool. I will ask my team to make sure we put that with the video. And so thank you. And would you be willing to just pray our time out?
Sure, absolutely. We really appreciate the opportunity, Mark.
Yeah, thank you.
Father, we thank you for this time. We pray that your hand and that your spirit would be upon our conversation as it goes out. And that, Lord, in everything that we say and everything that we do, that you would call us to walk more perfectly according to your ways, that we would love people more dearly, that we would shine your light in our world and your truth as we go. And in everything we say and do, Lord, may we honor and glorify your great name. We ask this for your name's sake. Amen.